We now have another great speaker, Anders from Finimize, and I will just let him talk away. Go for it, Anders. Cheers.
Thanks.
Give a round of applause for Anders.
Awesome, thanks. Cool, so is this working? Cool. Thanks. So I want to talk to you guys today about our experience at Finimize in building a minimum lovable product. So first off, I'm Anders. I'm the head of product at Finimize. So we're a fintech startup here in London who's been around for just over around 2 years, and we focus on making finance more accessible for millennials. So a little bit about me. I'm actually Canadian. So yeah, and I've been kind of designing and building websites since I was 16. Then I actually went off to school, studied business, and all my friends went to like banking, consulting, and I went to the tech space in Toronto. So I started working at a loyalty and payments company that served Fortune 500 clients. And there I basically made the full shift into design. So I got involved in a couple startups, some which didn't fully work, but some good lessons along the way. And eventually made my way over here to the UK, where I am now, and working at Finimize. And I also got a dog at some point in the process along there. So at Finimize now, one of the things that really I think we did really well in the early days is we built a brand that people loved. And we're essentially a finance company and a finance product. And to have people using the word love when they're talking about, in the early days especially, it was financial news, and I'll touch more on that further. People wear our t-shirts around campuses, they wear our hats. It's one of those things that once we noticed that was happening, we knew we were onto something. And our mission at Finimize is to make finance more accessible to millennials. So as I said, we started in late 2015, and our very first product was actually just a newsletter. So we took the 2 top stories of the day in finance, and we summarized them into a 3-minute read in a way that the average person could understand. So we took out all the jargon, and it's basically like a cheat sheet for the Wall Street Journal, more or less. Now in the last, since kind of beginning of 2016, that's grown to over 125,000 people around the world reading that just about every day, which has been amazing, and that's been a great success. But our mission for the company was always to kind of move on beyond that. And really what we're moving towards is a platform to rethink how you plan and manage your money. And that's really the tools to help you be your own financial advisor in reality. And that's currently in alpha. It's called Finimize My Life. And that's where the SaaS comes in with Finimize. So we basically have around 1,000 people using that in the UK in alpha. And we're kind of building that out now. So what that is we essentially create a financial plan for you. So if you go to a financial advisor today, that might cost £1,000 or £2,000. We do that at a fraction of the price. And we'll kind of ask some basic questions, your age, if your salary, your income, your savings, what you want to achieve in life, and then we'll generate a series of goals. And with those goals, we'll essentially, tell you should get an emergency fund. If you want to buy your own home one day, we'll kind of ask you where you live, suggest the price of that house based on your salary or region. And then after that, we'll essentially, go through taxes, mortgage, a few other things, and then create a payment plan for you on how much you need to set aside today and every month. And then when we go to execute that, we'll help you compare kind of the best providers for you. So if this is the case going into investments, it might help you set up a Nutmeg account, a Money Farm account, and then we'll help you actually track that as you go forward. So that's what we're building today, and that's in alpha at the moment. But while we're building that, we've basically learned 3 main lessons that I would say to building a product that users love from scratch. So lesson number 1 is just to don't build alone. I think that's really important from the early days. Second, especially when you're building an MVP, is to optimize for speed. And that's something that you can kind of start, I think you should always focus on, even if you're further down the pipeline with new features and everything. I think these 3 things kind of also play into that. And last but not least, really is just be human. And that's something that we've taken to heart from the early days and really has led to our success. So one mistake a lot of startups, a lot of companies make is, especially with their MVP, is they kind of have this mentality where it's like, if we'll just build the MVP and then we'll look for users later. And I think that's the biggest mistake you can make. You really don't want to build alone, and you want to start getting your early users from day 0. Because what that lets you do is it lets you prove there's actually demand for the product that you're building. And then once you've proven that, you can actually involve them in the process. And we've really taken these 2 things to heart. So how you actually get those early users is, there's a lot of different ways to do so. I would say the number 1 thing you should do is have a landing page and at least a wait list. kind of table stakes now, but you should at least start collecting emails. And what that lets you do is you can really even test different, different features. You can test different positioning statements. You can even test fully, different pivots that you were thinking you could have made just with that landing page alone before you go to build anything. You can also then use other channels before you start touching code. So in our case, we created this, what is essentially content marketing. We have this daily email. We have over 100,000 people now that we could launch into from day one once the product's ready. And we're actually using those to work with as we build. But there's lots of other channels. And then last but not least is just to hustle, especially as a startup. This was us at LSE last year. Around the same time, we actually had iPads. We were standing outside there at a careers fair. We were later told by LSE that we could never come back and that we had no permit to do such thing. But we got 500 to 600 users in a few hours standing outside there, and that's one of those things that I guess we have to find a different university every time. But you have to hustle in the early days, and it's one of those things that really helps you get those early users. And then once you have them, the next step is to really build with them. So you have an email, like an email list, wait list. You don't want that to go stale, so you really want to involve them in the process. And what we've done is share work in progress. You want to foster a community, so get people involved. You can source ideas and get feedback from them. In practice, the reality is, as a startup, you won't need as much help as you can get. That's possible, and your users are probably the best equipped to do that. So at Finimize in practice, we have an alpha, or a Slack group for our alpha users. We toss out new ideas, new features, mock-ups, get feedback on those. We also send out a monthly email to all of our waitlist, let them know what we're working on, invite them into the office for drinks and things, give them previews of ideas and get their feedback. And we keep in touch that way. We also do user tests. It's a great shot. And basically, we'll take people from the waitlist who have never actually seen the product and do an actual user test with them before they're actually allowed to use it and get feedback from a first perspective. We'll also send out research and surveys. We have people come in for events, and grab beers and kind of test in person. And we also make our entire roadmap public. And this is with all users from our waitlist and from our email. So these aren't people who are actually using the app today. And I think what that lets us do is then once we have all these users, we can get as much feedback possible, and then we can go on to actually building things. And the lesson there really is to optimize for speed with everything you do. And I think that also applies to even features if you're a kind of more stable, kind of later stage startup. So the way that in reality I find that works well is just to fake it till you make it with every single thing possible. So if there's any designers in the room, that's clickable prototypes. Marvel, who's from London, they're really great for that. InVision is another one. But really, before you touch any code, you should try and design it and get a user to touch that before you actually move forward in the process. If you do kind of get into code, another thing we do, which we've tried with, is doing feature previews as well as feature placeholders. So actually building things that aren't fully functional, but having them in the app, and then you kind of layer on functionality later. And both of those things basically let you get as much feedback as early as possible. The one thing I would say, which we've learned as a lesson, is to be careful about setting expectations with that. So essentially, if you're going to have all these fake things in there, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. We made that mistake in the very early days, and I think we've gotten a lot better at that. But it is one thing to be mindful of if you're kind of showing someone a clickable prototype, and then they're like, when's this going to be live? And you say, it might not ever, or whatever it may be. That's one thing you have to balance. So in reality, what this means is, our very first version of Finimize My Life, this is our alpha, literally had no functionality. So we had a UI. We asked you all the questions about you. We created some financial goals for you. But then literally, if you clicked through, it just said, this is what we're going to do once we code this up, basically, on every single step of the screen. So the UI worked. If a user tried to do something, we'd basically give them this screen that said, we're working hard. We had a little video of us in the team coding, asked for feedback. But we were able to launch that really quickly and get feedback on the UI, the interaction, the flows, as well as get feedback on what people actually wanted us to build versus where we were going before we had actually added in any financials and kind of gone that way with the product. Another thing you can do is add placeholder features. So this is a redesign that went live about a half hour ago. Just got back from that, so hopefully it's not broken. But essentially, one of the things we added is this graph up on the top of the page. The graph actually doesn't work. We haven't built it yet. But we built a placeholder feature. So a user can kind of get used to that being in there. They can also click on it and get more information about it. We can ask for feedback. And it's one of those things that in the coming months, we'll get around to adding it and making it functional. But for now, it shows what's to come in the app. And that's an easy way to get feedback without actually having to build something. Now, we've also faked it with pricing. So right now, if someone wanted to pay us, we literally don't have Stripe set up. We'd have no way to do it. We haven't spent the time getting that in place. But we did run pricing tests. So we had a fake paywall in the middle of our app where you'd kind of get through to a point, you'd click on something, and this modal would come up. And we'd make someone pick between 3 pricing plans. And we tested different models, different features, and we would just track clicks on that. And then if someone picked the £5 plan, we'd give them a modal right after that said, congrats, it's free. And kind of move forward going after that. But that was a great way to test pricing before we've actually built anything. And while we're in alpha, everything's free for users, but we now have this data before we move on. So then the next question is, once you go to build something, we found the number one rule to think about is to build the skateboard for everything you do. So I'm not sure if you're familiar. This is an image from Spotify, where they basically have this theory that if you want to build a car for your users, there's 2 ways you can do that. Number one is you can build 1 wheel, then you can build 2 wheels, then you can build a body, and then eventually you have a car. The other way is you build a skateboard, and then you build a scooter, and then a bicycle, a motorcycle, a car. And the difference is the skateboard still gets your user from A to B, and lets you get as early feedback as possible. So that's one thing that we've tried to look at for the app as a whole, but also for individual features. It's what is the kind of shitty, we'll be a little bit embarrassed by this, but what's the first way we can get feedback? And then you start kind of layering things on. So then the question is, after you decided what you want to build, it's who should you build that for? And one thing we found is, I'm not sure, this is a model from BJ Fogg, who's a Stanford professor, that essentially says, you have a user's motivation on the y-axis, so how motivated they are to do a behavior, so let's just say use your app in general, and then how easy it is to do on the x-axis. And the theory is anything in this kind of behavior area in the dotted line, if you can trigger that behavior, it's going to happen. So the right mix of motivation and how easy it is to do. For your very first version of something, you should target these users first. Essentially, people that are already really highly motivated to do something, but it's just not easy enough for them to do it yet today. Or maybe they're using a spreadsheet. It's kind of a pain in the ass. You just make that a little bit easier. And then that's your first version of a product. And then you can kind of move down down the scale, make it easier, look for people that are less motivated, and do that later. But if you can prove it works for people that are already motivated, that's the first way you can get something out there. So now that you're kind of building something, I think the next rule we've learned is, and we've taken this from the early days to heart, is just to be human. And I think that's really something at Finimize that we focused on. Everyone on the team really cares a lot about that, and I think it's really differentiated us. So the first thing, there's a few ways to do this, but the first way I would say is just to ask yourself what you stand for. Because a lot of companies solve problems, and a lot of them solve the exact same problem. But people love some of those companies for solving that same problem with just a dash of humanity. And I think that's something that you should, it's kind of obvious when you actually think about it. But if you think about your company, you probably have some competitors. If you think about any company in any space, software is sort of commoditized, where you can copy a feature from one team to another team. It might take a few months, but some customers are still going to choose one product over another based on how they feel about it and what their mission is. And that's one thing that we've focused on, is just being open and inviting and having our users join us for that journey. I think another thing you can do is to eat your own dog food with everything you do. This is one of the mantras that we have at Finimize. So we say, you need to ask yourself if I personally would use this before any feature goes live or goes into production, or even makes it past the design stage. And the answer ideally should always be yes. If it's not, you kind of have to figure out why. In some cases, that might be an operational reason, you just need to ship the code. In other cases, maybe you can fix something. There's just one thing missing. Obviously, this is easier if you're the user of your product. That in our case, we all want to use what we're building, so it does make it a little bit easier. But essentially, if you can put yourself in your user's shoes, that's one thing you should always ask. And then, last but not least, I would say you need to put a bit of yourself into the product. So it's really important that you empower anyone on your team to actually leave a mark on their work. And then you can kind of like, have them sprinkle some personality and joy into the details. So I think the Macintosh is a classic example of this, where if you kind of opened up one of the older models, the entire inside was signed by the original team. Obviously, that's kind of the extreme extent of it, but it's a product that you can kind of tell that humans worked on it. So in our example, and kind of in our case of this, it's little things that I think add personality to the product that we've tried to focus on. So one example is we were talking with an intern one day, and we were talking about video games. And we started talking about like cheat codes. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Konami code as a concept. So it's like a code that used to be in old video games. And a lot of websites around the internet have a thing where if you type the code on the page, like something happens. It's usually completely useless. But he wanted to add this to our app. And it was like a crazy idea that added no functionality. But we had a few hours, and we were kind of like, you know what, sure, why don't you go do it? So he went to the 404 page and basically added this in where you could tap up, up, down, down, left, right, BA, and then money just flies everywhere. And it's just emojis, just like that's it. It does nothing. That works on every page of the app. And some users who have found the 404 page and then found that have just done it, and we don't know why, but like it's kind of a fun thing. And it shows that there's like humans behind this building the product. Another example is our design was really shitty on big screens. So someone in the office had like a curved 4K TV screen, and we looked at it, we were like, that's awful. Instead of us spending time to design for a TV screen or like a screen that most people don't have, we basically added this little note that just pops up that kind of says, that's an awesome screen you have. And the users who've seen that, instead of complaining that this looks like shit on my amazing screen, like 3,000-pound screen, they laugh. And it's kind of like one of those things that also shows there's people behind the product building this. It's not just a corporation. It's just not just a company. So those are the things that like we plan to add a lot more. There's a couple other Easter eggs in there, but I think CityMapper also is another company that does a really good job of this. It's one of those things that lets you add some personality and humanity to the product. So to summarize, from our lessons, and they're not exhaustive, there's these 3 rules that we have for building a minimum lovable product. Number 1, don't build alone. Second, you really need to optimize for speed. And last but not least, you should be human. So thanks, Anders Kravis on Twitter, and appreciate your guys' time.
Thanks so much, Anders. That was awesome. Cheers. Thank you so much, Anders. Awesome.